Post-apocalyptic settings have been popular in movies for decades, but TV has often shied away from trying to show life after everything ends. And there are more than a few sci-fi shows that are set decades or centuries after the end, like Star Trek or Buck Rogers. In this video, we're going to look at 3 series made by the BBC between 1975 and 85 that depicted life after the end of our society, but on a BBC budget of £1.50 an episode, and that's including VAT.
Oh God. Please don't let me be the only one.
There are more shows that we could name drop, but these 3 are each, in their own way, enjoyable and have something to offer a modern viewer. Yet in other ways, they are horribly dated and anachronistic. Sometimes that often adds to the charm. I mean, they're as charming as you can get when dealing with the end of civilization. There's none of this Netflix and chill shit going on here. 2 are adaptations of popular books, and the other is an original creation. So we'll start with that. 1975's Survivors. By the mid-70s, writer Terry Nation was in a pretty good place. In the 60s, he'd been an unemployed comedy writer who took on some quick work to dash out 7 episodes for a new kids science fiction series the BBC was knocking together, before moving on to his next gig. Except those episodes introduced the Daleks, which put both Doctor Who and Terry Nation on the industry map. By the mid-70s, he was doing really well and living in a big house in the country, and like many middle-class English people who lived in big houses in the early 70s, he got interested in self-sufficiency, which is like doomsday prepping, but with a posher accent. Nation had a thought that if the world ended tomorrow, he would be useless since he didn't even know how to make a candle. Most people having the same thought would just swear off gin before 10 AM, but as a successful TV writer, Nation pitched an idea about the end of the world to BBC executives, and because his meeting started first thing after a liquid lunch at 3 PM, they bought the show before staggering to the bar in time for 5 o'clock drinkies. Survivors premiered on BBC television in 1975. The title sequence of this might seem slightly prescient, depicting a containment breach in a lab that leads to a scientist infected by a virus, who then spreads it throughout the world, thanks to jet travel. Thanks a bunch, jets. The main character, initially at least, was Abby Grant, played by Carolyn Seymour, later better known for multiple appearances in Star Trek, and dozens of video game voices where she's always the high priestess or some shit. Abby is a struggling housewife, trying to make ends meet in her tiny country house, with a tennis court and only a housekeeper to assist her, while her Jensen-driving husband works in London and her son is off at boarding school. Yes, it's mid-70s BBC, so their depiction of what they would call middle class is what would count in most people's books as pretty freaking rich. I mean, no one in this world would call her middle class. In this world, before the outbreak, Abby is about as useful as a social media influencer. But unlike a social media influencer, she'll find a place in the apocalypse. The show starts off fairly routinely for Abby. Well, as routine as you get when you have a housekeeper and a tennis court and a kid off at boarding school.
Gosh, that sounds exciting.
Each scene subtly increases the severity of the problem in the background.
Have you had many cases of it yet?
I've got a couple of dozen who are showing symptoms, but I think they're just trying to be fashionable.
First, there's a bit of a flu epidemic going on, and it's getting a bit serious. And then there are disruptions to services such as the trains. Tinder is offline, and hospitals are at breaking point since people either have the virus or blue balls. Watching this now, while the world is going through COVID-19, does kinda make you shit your pants, even though the mortality rate in Survivors is almost 100%. The cast is the key to selling what's going on. This was a prestige primetime drama for adults in its day, and full of experienced actors giving it their all. The child actors, on the other hand,
Mummy, where are you? Mummy? Daddy?
at the same time Survivors was made, this is what Doctor Who looked like. Meanwhile, Jenny, a secretary, is having problems with her roommate, who's bedridden and, more importantly, unable to pay her half of the rent. Her roommate's boyfriend won't help out with the rent since the roommate is scheduled to die in the next scene, but he paints a doom-laden picture.
Because if the death rate keeps accelerating at this speed, we're not going to be able to bury our dead.
We'll manage. Well, damn it.
Abby feels a bit off, has a fever, and wakes up a few days later to find her husband has died.
How awful.
And the people next door are dead.
Oh, how awful.
And the people across the street are dead.
Oh, that's awful.
And the people down the road are dead.
Gosh, that's awful.
As are the local shopkeepers.
Oh no, that's awful.
And that really snooty lady down at the post office.
Good riddance to bad rubbish.
Unlike almost every other drama the BBC was making, the series starts off with 2 female characters as its focus. Abby, despite being a struggling middle-class housewife, is strong and independent, a born leader by virtue of being middle class. while Jenny is more empathetic and feels the need to be around other people. Basically, she's easily led, but despite being more overtly frightened, she's resilient in her own way.
I thought I could manage. I've always been an independent sort of person. But the last week, the loneliness was more than I could bear. It was awful.
Both women have the situation mansplained by various guys they encounter.
We have had one survival, Jen. In all the cases we have admitted, only one person has lived beyond the crisis point.
The stockpile of things must be enormous.
Oh, it would be enough for many, many years, but that would be simply scavenging, wouldn't it? And a constantly diminishing supply.
But those freelance contract mansplainers are all dead by the end of episode 1. So the series introduced its own full-time in-house mansplainer in episode 2. Greg Preston is an engineer, and he's that favourite character from the 1970s, the sort of hero guy who keeps saying how he's just here for now and he probably won't hang around, even though you know he will hang around.
You will come back!
Nope.
You know this because he tells everybody he meets that he won't stick around.
I don't have any definite plans at the moment.
And he'll tell them why.
Oh, hang around for a while, I suppose, but well, I don't intend to take on a whole pack of responsibility.
Once he's on the scene and meets up with Abby and Jenny, Greg explains all the practical problems and solutions.
Oh, must have been bad in all cities. Be a long time before we can go into any of them in any sort of safety. All those unburied dead, and God knows what sort of disease building up.
So Jenny is the heart of the group and tells us what to feel and how an ordinary person would react.
That's been the worst thing for me, really. Just being on my own.
And Abby is the one who makes the difficult decisions.
I'll be realistic. It's too bloody late. I've already been in contact with her, so has Emma, and so has Charmian. And now, so have you.
Greg and Jenny become a couple fairly soon, a relationship that would endure throughout the entire 3-season run of the show. Survivor's first half dozen episodes are really about setting the scene in the immediate aftermath of the epidemic that has killed almost everyone. We see lots of corpses, but nothing too gruesome, not a single fly to be seen. Lots of people talking about rotting cities, but talk is cheap, just like the BBC, so there's lots of talking.
You been in London?
No.
Don't.
The trio explore the new world, keeping to the rural backroads, which helps keep the budget down, and come across little groups banding together, each with some philosophy that, for some reason,
You must get pregnant.
puts off Abby, Jenny and Greg before the inevitable happens, and that group settles down in one enormous house to set up a new community. Then the show becomes less of an adventure and more of a soap opera. Characters come and go, or are recast, or killed off screen at the whims of the producer, Terence Dudley, who managed to annoy the series creator, Terry Nation, who left, and the series star, Carolyn Seymour, who left, and most of the series writers, who left. The second year changed locations to a commune and became even more of a soap opera. With Abby Grant gone, the void is filled by Charles Vaughan.
Unless we commit ourselves here, we'll always be just squatters whatever we grow.
For one season, there's Ruth, a doctor, instantly the most valuable person in the community and a constant target for kidnapping. Actors Dennis Lill and Ian McCulloch apparently didn't get on, so for the third season, it was structured in a way that neither of them shared a scene together, with a knock-on effect making it very hard to tell stories when your main cast just can't stand each other's guts. Producers felt unable to build up side characters without killing them off for very little dramatic purpose. It's like Game of Thrones, but without the dragons or boobs. No sooner than a regular had been introduced, than they were killed off or just forgotten about. It's like Chuck Cunningham. Some lasted longer than others, including this ghoulish kid auditioning for The Omen.
You'll be dead soon. Goodbye.
The series was really just about a small group of people trying to build a community, while at the same time defending themselves from people who just wanted to scavenge and take what they wanted. Since this is a show that has to build a world, we often get characters setting out their philosophy. Basically, they're episode writers' theories on what would happen, always from a middle-class writer's perspective. One standout dramatic episode with no action scenes and little violence is the first series episode Law and Order, which revolved around one of the community being found dead, and how that small mini-society deals with justice. One terrible effect of the world ending in 1975 is that the survivors who have to deal with famine, disease, marauders, and packs of rabid dogs have to deal with the worst thing of all, being locked into clothing that was fashionable in 1975. So everybody in this dresses like a teacher from the 1980s. Survivors is a bunch of good ideas that aren't always fully explored. Like that friend who's always coming up with schemes that sound amazing until you give them 30 seconds worth of thought and you realise just how terrible they are. Like the time I got the idea to start a YouTube channel. Survivors got to a point where the new society basically started to mimic the old one by reintroducing currency and getting hydroelectric power working, so Survivors didn't survive to a 4th season. It was revived by the BBC decades later with a semi-decent revival starring Julie Graham as Abby Grant that ran for 2 seasons, but it was cancelled just as it was getting semi-interesting. Never change, BBC. Next up was the BBC's 1981 miniseries adaptation of John Wyndham's classic novel, Day of the Triffids.
And they sicken me too. And what sickens me most of all, that inside this mess, they are the only things that are going to fatten and thrive.
At about 150 minutes, Day of the Triffids treads a different path to Survivors, while also revisiting some of the same themes. Obviously, a killer plant is a much more fantastical thing than a killer virus, but stranger things have happened.
Well now, folks, get a load of what's going on in Ecuador. Vegetables on vacation.
Day of the Triffids is set in a world where a new plant, a Triffid, has been proven to be an excellent source of oil, so they are bred on farms in huge numbers. Oh, I hope that doesn't turn out to be a bad idea. The Triffids are large, can move, and just for shits and giggles, they are carnivorous. Ooh, I hope breeding large numbers of Triffids doesn't end up being a bad idea.
If it were a choice of survival between a blind man and a Triffid, I know which I'd put my money on.
But you're assuming equal intelligence.
Bill Mason works on a Triffid farm, but catches a blow from a Triffid stinger and is temporarily blinded.
Because suddenly the scientists realised that the nasty old Triffid was the same plant from Russia that produced the wonderful oil.
When we meet him, he's in hospital the night before his bandages are due to be removed, and he misses a spectacular meteor shower. He gets sick of waiting and he takes off the bandages himself, only to find that everybody else is blind. Rather than stick around and help an almost entirely visually impaired population, he hooks up with the young woman, Josella, who also missed the meteor shower.
I think I'd like to know you from today. Do you know me from today? Might not like what I was yesterday. I might not like what you were.
Together and separately, they come across various attempts to put society back together, attempts that fall apart for various reasons before, inevitably in a show called Day of the Triffids, somebody remembers that there are supposed to be Triffids in this. And so the Triffids suddenly pop up and polish off the blind humans.
We won.
Yeah.
You having a laugh?
Hello, Bill. You've been a long time.
Breeding Triffids in huge numbers was pretty much an own goal.
You wanna go, mate?
Day of the Triffids does a pretty good job of showing us deserted streets, but no BBC budget would ever be enough to show us crumbling, overgrown cities. So again, as in Survivors, there's a lot of talking about things the budget can't show us.
Been growing all day, driving through the desolation out there. Village after village, house after house, not a breath of human life anywhere.
Get out of my pub! In this series called Day of the Triffids, one remarkable thing is how little the Triffids actually appear on screen until the last 45 minutes or so. And even then it's still mostly people talking about Triffids rather than seeing them. It's like watching that one season of The Dukes of Hazzard that had these guys in it.
Here, mate, watch where you're going. Oh, asshole! You're starting something, pal.
Day of the Triffids had a fairly significant impact on viewers back in the day, much more so than the awkward 1960s film adaptation, which grafted on a happy ending to the original story. The book and the BBC Day of the Triffids don't end with a victory, just our main characters pausing for a breath and vowing to go on, just like me when I'm halfway up the stairs.
Are our chances getting better?
If it weren't for the Triffids, I'd say we had a very good chance.
The story was revisited again decades later with another miniseries, this time with a budget healthy enough to depict the end of the world properly. But it manages to completely miss the point with gimmicky direction and terrible characters and plotting. The last show of the trio we're looking at is another book adaptation, The Triffids. John Christopher's trilogy of what we now call young adult books was set in a world many years after society was wiped out and the world reset to a pre-industrial revolution level of technology. But here, the Earth had been invaded by aliens who get about in these giant three-legged machines known, funnily enough, as tripods. They aren't bragging, they really do have 3 legs. Each season of the show was envisaged to be an adaptation of one book of the trilogy. This being the BBC, let's see how that works out. Once people reach their mid-teens, they go through a ceremony that involves them being capped by a tripod, basically a brain implant to suppress humanity's resistance to being dominated and keep control of a docile, unquestioning population, like Fox News. A trio of teenagers decide they want a cap-free lifestyle and embark on a journey to the White Mountains, where they have heard there are freemen, possibly Morgan, certainly Martin, but no Gordon. An entire 13-episode season depicts the journey to the White Mountains at a, let's be charitable, relaxed pace. So it's sort of an adventure, but without all that much adventure. It's also aimed at a younger audience than Survivors or Day of the Triffids, since it has 3 teenagers for lead characters: Will, Henry, and Jean-Paul, also known as Beanpole. Characters in this are easily sidetracked with romance and the like, so it's a show that probably works better in an age of binging TV rather than waiting a week for nothing to happen and then another week where nothing happens. Maybe the tripods will show up next week. Nah. The titular tripods are conspicuous by their absence throughout much of the first season in particular, mainly because they're incredibly expensive to realise. Yet when they do appear, they are creepy, scary, and for something made in the mid-80s all on videotape, really well done. Tripods feature some of the BBC's finest visual effects work of the mid-80s. Now don't laugh. The second season makes an attempt to increase the action and show a bit more of the tripods in their controllers, creatures known as masters, as the heroes have now infiltrated the tripod city of gold and lead. Whereas in the first season the production values were outstanding, mainly because nothing ever happened, the extra ambition to the story does strain the BBC budget just a little bit more. This second season ended on a cliffhanger, with the intention to wrap up the story in a third and final season. Wow, what a cliffhanger! I can't wait to see what happens in the final season. Except there wasn't one, huh?
Has it all been for nothing?
This being the BBC in the mid-80s, the top brass really hated science fiction, and so Tripods was cancelled. The decade that started with the BBC making Doctor Who, Blake 7, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Flip Side of Dominic Hyde and Day of the Triffids, and also had them making Tripods, Z for Zachariah and Star Cops, ended with Red Dwarf as their only science fiction production. Survivors succeeds because it shows you what you need and rarely gets too ambitious for the show's budget. Day of the Triffids likewise spends more time with the people rather than showing us the crowd-pleasing Triffids. Tripods rations its tripod appearances so that we're not watching wobbly shots that should have demanded an extra retake had there been more time. But Tripods was let down somewhat by variable acting from a younger, less experienced cast than the other shows we've covered. The Tripods books were popular for decades, so it wouldn't be surprising to see someone take another crack at Tripods at some point in the future. So while you're in lockdown, it might seem like the end of the world is potentially happening right now.
We have to make the world good for them to make it better.
It's not. But if you want to scare the shit out of yourselves now, here are 3 shows that any right-minded conspiracy theorist will tell you is a prediction coming true. What guff. They're 3 old TV shows that are still charming and watchable decades later. All of these shows have the following in common. The main characters are trying to regain their independence or freedom, or getting away from philosophies they don't agree with. These days we just unfriend them. The BBC still makes the odd sci-fi drama that's not about a vagrant in a telephone box, and occasionally they set it in a post-apocalyptic environment. The most recent was 2019's War of the Worlds, a 3-episode miniseries, so excruciatingly execrable it's like trying to shit out of football. Maybe it's best to avoid the end of the world after all. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, and check out some of our other videos. Wash your hands and stay safe.